Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending on your time zone. Welcome to the first Tableau Analytic User Group after summer breaks. So, what do we have for you today? Today, we will have like an excellent webinar that Sedal will introduce the speaker in some minutes. So, just like to sum up for the one that are new to this Tableau Analytic User Group, it's a little unique, let's say like this, because it's really dedicated to learning all about analytic in Tableau, Tableau desktop, web edit, or as data. So if you want to subscribe, we have the QR code here. We also have our forum page with all the previous webinar. Please feel free to check, to ask us any question. You can also follow us on social media. So some rule of the game for you today. So if you want, yes, obviously, I forgot the introduction. My name is Annabelle Rincon. I'm leading the Tableau Center of Excellence at Fontobel, which is a Swiss bank. You see, I should not have taken any holiday. And Sedal is a consultant in digital intelligence and insight for Purple Strategy. So we both are the leader of this Tableau user group, and Sedal will have some news for you at the end of this session concerning that. And yes, some rule of the game for you. If you want to say where you are coming from, you can totally use the chat. And but if you have any question, please use the Q&A because it's much easier for us to monitor it. And yeah, so we can ask after the presentation all the questions that you have for our speaker. And exactly, the session is being recorded. So don't worry if you miss like the first minutes. You will send the recording afterwards by email and also promote it in social media. And don't hesitate to send us love for us or for the speaker that we have today on social media, in Twitter, for instance. And which slide I forgot? Sedal, I'm sure that I forgot a lot of slides. I was totally disruptive today.
No
Please
worries.
go ahead with the agenda.
Yeah, no worries. You covered it just so we can flag faces here. Annabelle and I have been working on this for the past year or so, and so having a lot of fun with it. You can see me here and my love for wine. Annabelle, I can't let a session go by without showing your chocolate and dogs. So those are the only things that I would highlight before we get to our awesome panel. So this session is going to have a great group of people. We've got three outstanding panelists. I will take a quick second to make some announcements at the end, but not without making sure that our speakers have adequate time. So the first session is from Vince Baumel. He is a Tableau ambassador and senior consultant at Doherty Business Solutions. He has been within the Tableau community for the past 5 years and spent 2 of them as a Tableau ambassador. He's been an active member of the community for quite some time. When not working, he is reading, writing, and building things. He is actually in his, I would assume, Tableau/Lego studio at the moment. With that, he's going to present on what's called Sunrise to Sunset, a creative's journey. So I'm going to let him share screen and get us started.
All right, let's get this started. Very good. Hi, everybody. Like he said, my name is Vince, and I am honored to talk to you today about something that means a lot to me. In the past, I've had the privilege to speak about perspective, about the power of community, about the importance of humility in asking for help. I've talked about leveraging psychological vulnerabilities to tell the most impactful stories possible. But today I get to tackle a new subject, and one that, if I get it right, has the chance to not only make you a better analyst, but might also bring you some clarity and a new appreciation for where you are in life. Let me start by introducing myself. Like I said, my name is Vince. I'm a senior consultant for Doherty Business Solutions. I've been in the data industry for almost 10 years now, and I was just elected to my third term as a Tableau ambassador in the social media branch. I live in Minnesota with my wife, my 3 sons, and our new puppy, Libby. Life is busy and full of distractions and loud and wild, and I wouldn't trade a single second of it. So in many ways, I think that the method by which we develop as creative people mirrors the way that we develop through life in general. Today, I'd like to explore an idea that Swiss psychologist Carl Jung came up with back in 1960. When he talked about life being, in a broad sense, split into 2 halves. He likened it to a day, where in the morning the sun will rise, and at some point it reaches a midpoint, right? A zenith in the sky where the sun sits at its highest point. And then it starts to move into the second half of the day, the afternoon. And if we can think of life through this metaphor, then I expect that we can view our creative journeys this way too, right? With a broad enough picture, I believe that we can learn to read the signposts along the way about where we are and what to expect as our perspective shifts, and where we can look for inspiration and energy. And Jung explains why it's so crucial to know where you are on this journey when he says that we cannot live the afternoon of life according to the program or programming of life's morning. Because, you know, what was great in the morning will be little at evening, and what in the morning was true, in the evening will have become alive, right? Because your perspective totally shifts. Now, as with several of my other talks that lean a little bit philosophical, this isn't necessarily a takeaway simply for those who spend their days doing data visualization and analysis. It's for anyone who does something creative, right? Whether that thing is writing, cooking, music, filmmaking, teaching, or anything else like that. Our journeys, broadly speaking, evolve in these 2 halves. And if we can learn to see them for what they are, we can absorb the insight and the goodness out of each stage, and then learn to move on when it's the right time for us to do so. So let's unpack Jung's idea a little bit. He says that we all start in the morning of life, and that in this morning, the important things to us are things like defining a sense of self and finding personal success. In this stage, we seek to carve out a little social space for ourselves and to work out who we are in relation to the people directly around us. And, you know, we want to begin building this successful career for ourselves and to be seen, you know, as professionals. And there's nothing wrong with that. We all start in that place. And I believe that we all should start in that place. And this is also where our sense of ego is formed as well. We develop an idea of self-worth as we begin to find the natural place that our puzzle piece fits into. And although it's a little bit dangerous, we start to get a sense of our own impact, right? Both good and bad, on the people and the work around us. So it's in this morning of our lives where we begin to make a lot of really important decisions for ourselves. We think about, you know, where do we want to live, or what kind of house that we would like to have one day, what kind of car we would like to drive, what sort of person do we want to partner with, do we want children one day, what do we want our lives in a general sense to look like. And we start to make these decisions about what we believe broadly as well. What do we think about society? How do we think it should be run? What do our personal politics look like? Do we factor spirituality into the way that we see the world? What's our philosophy about life? And one of my favorite authors, Richard Raw, uses this analogy of building a box at this stage of our lives that we use to contain all of the ideas that we have about life, the universe, and everything, and how things work. So what does the morning of our creative journey look like? Well, it's the same, really, isn't it? We're trying to sort of map out and define these aspects in exactly the same sort of ways. We're trying to work out our unique perspective, our style. What are those little details and signature flourishes that are going to make our work immediately recognizable as ours? And we begin to build these ideas of what our ideal job looks like and what kind of people that we want to surround ourselves with. To quote a famous mid-20th century television baron, here's some simple advice. Always be yourself. Never take yourself too seriously, and beware of advice from experts, pigs, and members of parliament. Kermit the Frog. So in this stage, we begin to obsess about things like techniques and tips and tricks, and we try to teach ourselves all of these little hacks to get our tools to do exactly what we want them to do, right? We test out every different style imaginable, and we spend a tremendous amount of time focusing on the latest shiny tool or update. And we pore over as many blog posts and podcasts and YouTube videos and books and forums and conversation threads that we possibly can, right? We dive in head first and we thrive on loading up our mental bandwidth on all of these things. And I think that's a good thing, right? This is absolutely the right time in our journey to be that sponge for new information. And we start to look at the work that a lot of other artists that we greatly respect are doing. And we occasionally will borrow tiny pieces of their style or their methodology. And we begin to start to incorporate it into what we are doing to help, define our own personal style, right? Our own configuration of those little stylistic choices that other people that we look up to are making. And we start to put out work that we believe in that moment best represents exactly who we are in creative form. So the mornings of our creative journeys can be really exciting times. And I think they should be, because we're just at that point starting to get to grips with this art form that we've chosen. And we're trying lots of different things out, and all of that potential of what our work could look like down the road is right in front of us for the taking. But it can also be a frustrating time, right? Because it's hard to grab that potential. It always seems to just be slipping through our fingers. Now, if you're like me, when I was starting out, I looked at so many tutorials trying to find those magic techniques so that, everything would just snap into place and my work would look like I imagined it could be, or I'd look at tutorials thinking, oh, if I just got Figma or Procreate or Illustrator or whatever else, then my work would really pop. And I began doing all sorts of mental gymnastics to try and figure out how I'd be able to afford licenses for these things or trainings, but it never quite seemed to snap into place the way that I wanted it to. Take my first full Tableau public viz that I published, for example. Now, I did this relatively early in the morning of my journey, and I poured every single trick I had into this one small dashboard, right? Pseudo neomorphism card design, non-standard shapes, a custom image for the title, hybrid floating and tiled layout. I had aggregate and disaggregate data visualization. I had dashboard actions, non-white background, URL hyperlinks, you name it. If I knew about it as a trick, I poured it into this thing. And I was convinced that although I wasn't sure exactly what sort of style I was going for, one of these techniques was bound to unlock some sort of hidden and undiscovered sense of self, and that was the potential that I was after. Now, in all of this, I was hoping to find some kind of relatively quick win formula that I could just apply like a filter to all of my work, and that would become, my signature, the style that made people view my work and as valuable and worthy of their attention and immediately recognize it as mine. Of course, when I look back to the morning of my journey now, I can see what a mess I was making. But it was an absolutely necessary mess, because I don't know any other way to teach yourself in any art form than to try a little bit of everything and to see what sticks. To start choosing for and against different techniques as you you start to take some distance back. You step back from what it is you're creating and you decide whether or not you actually like what you've done. And in the end, continuing to do this will start to slowly emerge a more mature style. This is all the work of the morning, all of the exciting experimentation and refining and honing what you actually want to be. I look back at my own stage and realize how essential this stage was for me and how much I learned from that time, even from the stuff that I ended up leaving on the cutting room floor. And I also recall how desperately impatient I was for results. And I'm sure a lot of you can probably relate. So how do you know when you're reaching the end of that first half, the end of your morning? And how do you know when you've begun to arrive at that kind of zenith, that high noon point? Carl Jung was the first to talk about the midlife crisis. And he talked about it using this analogy of reaching the end of the morning and the sun reaching its highest point in the sky. And he said that that point was characterized by a lot of questioning, right? Questions about, what have I built in that first half? What did I construct in the morning? And was it really what I wanted? Have I made the right decisions, or have I made mistakes in my choices? What does all of it mean? Reaching that high point, that high noon point in real life can be a very scary moment, because we're full of doubt and questioning, and there's this internal war going on inside of us as we look at everything that we've built and we wonder, do I actually like the person that I've constructed? And more often than not, I think the answer to that is going to be along the lines of, well, a lot of it, no, I don't like, and I know that I need to change it. A lot of us are very scared of change, right? We often reach that high noon because of some specific crisis that happens to us that might trigger or catalyze it. Maybe it's losing a job or losing a relationship that's really significant to us. And what we do is, we reach for this metaphorical box of answers that we built for ourselves in the morning of life. That box that contains everything that we believe about the ways that life should work. And we open it up and we start to reach into it to pull out our answers that are going to help us through this crisis. But we have to be honest with ourselves, and say that none of those answers specifically help our pain anymore. It just doesn't work. This for everybody is a really scary moment, and some people handle it better than others. We have kind of the stereotypical idea of the middle-aged man who hits a midlife crisis and he starts acting a bit confused, and he goes out and he buys a motorcycle, or maybe he leaves his partner for a younger person because he thinks that his confusion is going to be answered by just rearranging these superficial details of his life, instead of admitting to himself deep down that everything he's built inside doesn't really work anymore, and that's where the work really needs to be done. Or others go into complete denial, right, and won't admit that what they've built no longer works. And I think that can lead to internalizing everything and can turn into bitterness, especially down the road into your later years of your journey. I've seen this happen with people late in their career where they haven't been willing to admit to themselves that the way that they used to do their job simply doesn't work anymore, right? They're so convinced that their tried and true method is the only right one that they automatically close off anything new. And they don't want to face the reality of their own shortcomings, right? Like, it makes me think of startup entrepreneurs and project managers. People in those kind of roles seem particularly vulnerable to this, where it's very easy for them to establish a pattern of behavior and then to get stuck in that rut and end up unwilling to change things up, to shake things up. But the best of us, when we reach that high noon point in life, take it as our cue to move into the afternoon of life, to close the chapter on the morning of our lives and to gracefully shift as best as we can our perspective. So what does noon look like on your creative journey? Well, I think it's exactly the same, right? It's us looking back at everything that we've built in the morning of our creative journey and realizing that no matter how many techniques we threw at this, and no matter how many blogs we read, and no matter how many tweets we bookmarked to help ourselves find that perfect style for us, it hasn't quite delivered us the success that we wanted with our work, however we choose to define that success. We start to admit to ourselves that maybe we're not getting the dream results that we'd hoped for, or we're not as popular as we want, or we're not making the kind of money that we had planned. Perhaps we're not really proud of where we ended up, and maybe spending so much time chasing those quick wins just to impress other people may not have been the right approach. Maybe it's okay to reassess and to take a step back and to start to build something deeper and more meaningful. For my own journey, it wasn't really a specific event that ushered in this high noon, but more of a creeping realization that my work wasn't headed in the direction that I wanted it to go, right? I'd look at work by Zach Bowders or Lindsay Poulter or Diego Parker, and I'd be so envious of how they managed to balance elegance and impact in their work. I had to be honest with myself and admit that I didn't like the style of my own work, and that perhaps many of those techniques that I was using were simply to impress other people rather than to be a tool to produce really meaningful work in my own life. And I had to face the reality that all of those years spent experimenting and learning and discovering had only landed me in a place where I didn't like my own style, where it didn't feel meaningful, where I was consistently, criticizing my own work for being too fussy, overly complicated, and a whole other litany of faults. It was an incredibly frustrating and scary point for me. Perhaps some of you can relate, but this point was the one and only time that I thought, it might be nice to just walk away from this thing altogether. Like the midlife crisis, maybe I could just take this as my opportunity to overcompensate and to run out and completely reinvent myself once again, to try and regain that feeling of youth and to go into denial about the dead end that I hit, or maybe to start to politely shut out those people who would question the direction that my own path had led. Thankfully, though, I knew about this two halves dynamic, and I took the opportunity to read the signposts of where I was and to realize that the afternoon of my journey was right around the corner. So what does the afternoon of our journey look like? Well, Jung talked about it being characterized by a greater openness, where we don't necessarily feel the need to desperately define things neatly anymore. We're more able to hold paradox, and we don't have to put things into neat boxes. And we also start to slowly and patiently question what we built in life's morning. And we start to question, we start to let go of these things that, if we're honest with ourselves, don't really work anymore. And we start to simplify our lives. I love that phrase, simplify. And we look around at all of the things that we had built in life's morning, and we can see the things that were just designed to show off and shout about who we are. And we can start to define, who we are individually rather than who we are in relation to everybody else, around us. And we stop trying to necessarily get people's attention in the same way. In the second half of life, that's not really as important as it was in the first half. So we can start to let a lot of that stuff go without feeling like we're missing out. We get a better sense for what's meaningful to us and what we should build into the longer term. And to those around us who make it to the afternoon of their journey, and not everyone does, by the way, they become the sages, they're the village elders, they're the paragons in our community. They've let go of some of their extensive bag of tricks, and they're no longer trying to define and let you know who they are. They're unthreatened, and they're able to be there for others in really profound and meaningful ways. This is really highlighted in arenas like mentorship. And it's one of the aspects of the Tableau community that absolutely sets it apart. So for me, this stage of my journey comes with a sense of clarity, a sense of deliberation in what I create. And while it may not be as flashy as, a lot of the stuff that's out there, it holds more meaning to me. The things that I produce now are things that I'm more proud of because I've let go of this idea that more is inherently better. Now, I don't want it to sound like I've got it all figured out. I definitely don't. But my perspective now is one that I wouldn't have if I hadn't gone through the morning of my journey. You have to be patient with yourself. Don't try to rush through the morning because it's not wasted time. It's building a foundation and a security that will make the rest of your journey worth it. That morning time may take years. It certainly did for me. But everything that you build in terms of knowledge and all of those techniques do go with you into that second half. You can still tap into that knowledge when you need to. So enjoy where you're at. There is no good or bad stage. Both are absolutely essential to a career and to a journey that brings you joy and meaning and value. Don't give up when you hit that high noon point, because it's at that point that so many people throw in the towel. If you find yourself thinking, I've worked so hard and for so long, but I'm not seeing the results that I want at all. Remember the words of Winston Churchill. If you're going through hell, keep going. This next stage is going to be deeper, better, and absolutely worth it. Now, I thought a bit about how to illustrate this concept of the two halves of our journey through the medium of data visualization. And since I already showed you something that I had built in the morning of my journey, why not walk you through a viz that I might construct just after kind of that high noon point, right? So if you'll join me, I'll head into Tableau to answer the question, how did my sales compare to last year? So excuse me as I begin to build something. So I'm using a data set as kind of a bit of an expansion on Superstore, where it just brings in a little bit more global information. So let's start with a title bar, because everybody loves a title bar. So we'll bring segment and mark it out, right? I want this to be something that just serves as kind of a kind of column headers up at the top. And I will bring, there's not the text, and I will find, oh no, this is not working. Oh, there it is. Segment and market. There you go. I like that. So hide that. And we'll bring this onto text. Shrink that down. This is the part that I always get frustrated with. So let's move on. I'm going to do this basically, and it's not going to be super pretty this time, but that's okay. So let's color that. We'll change the alignment to center, and then up here, we'll format this to maybe like a gray. And bump this up. Now let's move on. I want this to be the kind of the line chart of our biz, comparing our sales to that of the previous. So the month of this, I wish you could kind of change this so that it always defaults to event or entire view. That would be awesome. So let's do sum of sales, and then I'm going to create something that I like to do when I'm building a viz that's going to be a little bit more sparse, right? So this will be most recent sales. And we're going to say if the last mark of visualization equals 0, then give me the sum of sales. Sam. Easy peasy. So bring that up. That's exactly what I want. So I'm going to dual axis, I'm going to synchronize this axis. And what this is going to do is this is just going to give me a dot at the very end of it. So that, don't want that. And I'm going to make this circle and size it down a little bit. All right, just clean it up ever so slightly. And what I'm going to do from here is I actually want to bring the 2 years in question out. So let's look at 13 and 14. Now I can actually start to color these how I want. All right, so I like that, but we want our current to stand out and we want our previous year to maybe be a little bit more subdued in the back. All right, so far so good. Let's call that line chart. Not what I wanted. So let's go on to what's going to be in the middle of our biz. I want people to be able to see what month this is, but not necessarily in that way. So let's build month chart. So we'll do count of month. Actually, it is month of order date. And bring month of order date on to text. And now we're getting there. So let's fit the width, make this a little bit bigger. And let's change that background color. And give it a white border. All right, so far so good. Except the order is out of place. So, sorry, I don't often do live demos. So Jennifer versus, there we go. Yeah. You know what? Let's keep moving on. I'll give you guys the general idea of what I'm going for. So I want to do a visualization to go underneath this, and I call it year over year months, right? So this is going to give me a little bit more of a breakdown of where we were compared to the year before. Now this is going to require me to build a few calculations out. So I'll try and do that as quickly as I can. So let's do 2013 sales. We're going to say if the year order date is 2013, and give me sales. And I want to duplicate this because I want another version of that, specifically calling out 2014 sales. And since I have those two fields, I'm going to make another calculation that says if the sum of 2014 sales is greater than or equal to the sum of 2013 sales, then add else. It's going to give me a good indicator, a nice way of doing that. And because we have these two 2013 and 2014 calculations, we can also put together a pretty easy calc for year over year change. Right, this is probably going to feel pretty familiar for, a lot of people. So we'll do sum of 2014 sales minus the sum of 2013 sales. And I'm going to divide that by 2013 sales. That's going to give me a percentage change. And then finally, let's do a delta. So we're going to say if year-over-year change is greater than 0, then you know what? Actually, I'm going to, because this is Unicode, I'm going to copy something in. Right, you can put Unicode symbols into calculations and it will work just the same. All right, so now that we have that, let's start to build this out. We're going to look at month of order date. We want to look at the 2013 sales against the 2014 sales. To dual axis, and I'm going to synchronize. Now in this case, I want the 2013 sales to be bar and the 2014 sales again bar. Right, this will work sort of like that. And now the color of this bar, I want to be based on this year-over-year change. Right, so we can try and indicate where that might be going from good to bad. And make sure I'm doing this right. And the 2014, we're going to color by ahead or behind. And let's bring out some other information. I want this to be percentage. And why not bring the delta out too? Forget that. I'm running out of time. Okay, so now I'll show you how I would put something like this together. So let's make this 50. And we're just going to start dragging stuff in. Title bar, do our line chart, get our months under that. And this is not at all the prettiest way to do this, but I have a much more polished version of this on my Tableau public profile. I can show you. That we don't need that because we already have the measurement for in there. Now so yeah, I have a much more polished version of this on my Tableau public profile, but something kind of like this where it's a lot simpler. I don't necessarily have a ton of filtering available, and it's more clearly driven by what you see on there. In the version on my Tableau public profile, I have these annotated in a really nice kind of clear, easy way to view it, and these are aligned with the months and everything. So yeah, I encourage you guys to check that out. And in the meantime, I wanted to jump back in and just kind of yeah, thank you guys. There's a ton of other things that you could have been doing, but you're here with me, and I appreciate that. So thanks.
You guys hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Sorry, my Zoom is a little bit weird right now, but thank you, Vince. That was awesome and really helpful. We did have a couple of quick questions, and maybe for this one you can write it out since you're not sharing anymore. But there was a question about the most recent date when you kind of created that circle at the end of the line graph. If you could either show or write out that calculation, I think that would be really helpful.
Yeah, I'll drop that in the chat. It's a table calculation that puts everything else as null except for the last point in the viz. So
got it. Awesome. And then there were a couple of questions, and now I'm probably gonna lose them. But at the very least, I remembered one of them, which was I think one was a more impressiveness of the fact that you have 3 kids and a puppy and have done all of this really thoughtful consideration. But to me, to break it down a little bit, I'm curious as well that this does take a little bit more thought than reading a book, reverse engineering a dashboard, things like that. I guess, how do you kind of plan out the way you think about visiting, given that your process tends to take more time to think and maybe less time to build and work on things?
Yeah, so for me, I always come back to whether it's something that I'm creating personally or something that I'm creating for work. I always come back to this question of like, what question keeps you up at night about this, right? If it's something for work, that's a very easy question to ask the people who are requesting you to build something for them. Like, okay, well, if you had to write it down in 10 words, what's the one thing that you wish you could know immediately? And that gives you a starting point. I did a personal viz about Paw Patrol, and because my kids loved Paw Patrol, and the question that I had was like, it seems like Chase, the puppy on Paw Patrol, who's the German Shepherd, it seems like he gets all the best jobs. Is there actually really good equal representation in that show amongst the various puppies that are used to handle emergency situations? And so, like, it was very tongue-in-cheek and very kind of absurdist that I would take a very deep dive analytical approach to a children's TV show. But yeah, I start with that question, and I put more time into crafting that question, because then I'm designing and I'm building something that is specifically tailored to answer that question. And I'm not trying to answer 500,000 potential questions at once. I can be a lot more prescriptive. So
yeah, no, that's great and super helpful. And then the other question was around kind of the idea of the sunrise and sunset, and their question was really kind of, can there be multiple moments? I guess, can you start to go through your afternoon and maybe there's another moment of and one of the things that the person mentioned was around multiple midlife crises or multiple kind of moments. I guess, how do you think about that, or do you view it as kind of one big thing?
Yeah, I think there absolutely can be more than one. I think that the process of us going from being new in a particular art form to being what we would consider an expert in that art form has to occur in multiple stages, right? As we start to refine who we are and what brings meaning to our own work, that might very well change. Look at any successful artist in history, and they have phases, they have periods where they kind of go through certain styles that kind of stick for a while, and then maybe they feel that urge to move in a new direction. So I think it's absolutely possible. I think that the more often you go through that, the better equipped you are to identify that you're getting to that point again, and you can approach it with a more wise perspective, and maybe subsequently you don't carry that same questioning and self-doubt into the second or third or fourth or fifth time that you're going through that. So maybe that's a transition that gets easier over time. Yeah, I think we're all on a continuous journey of refining what brings value to us.
Awesome. Well, thank you again. This was really, really interesting, and appreciate you taking the time out for sure.
Yeah, happy to do so. Thanks, guys.
Yeah. So let me head back just very quickly. All right. So next up, we have Chantilly. And I suppose if you're really new to the Tableau community, you may not have met her, but I have seen enough of her speaking to know that she has been out and about quite a bit. And most of us have encountered her in one way or another. But for those who haven't, Chantilly is a Tableau Zen master. She's also the vice president of Lovelytics, and has started her own organization, Millennials and Data. And I'm sure she will go more into it because I think it could be really useful for anyone that might be in the area, or I know that there's a virtual version as well. Chantilly's mission is to empower corporations and individuals through the use of data viz and analytics. And as I mentioned, her organization, #MAD, works to bridge the data literacy and analytics gap through training, mentoring, and preparing millennials to enter a data-driven environment. I know many of her graduates have gone on to be really powerful figures in the Tableau world. So a lot of us have her to thank for that. And so she's going to give a really awesome talk that I have seen once, but I get something from it every time I listen to it, called Design Secrets for a Non-Designer, which I'm appreciative of as a complete non-designer and analyst. So with that, I'll give it to Chantilly.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Alrighty. Can you see my screen?
Yep, go for it.
Alrighty, well, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for having me today. I have the pleasure of speaking to you all about design secrets for a non-designer. And I like to call this one the business edition because I've done this presentation several times. I actually launched it at the last in-person TC conference that we had, and I centered it around my personal journey. So I decided to revamp that presentation and focus more on the business side of things and show users how they can incorporate these same tips and tricks into their business dashboards. With that, I'm Chantilly Jaggernauth, Vice President of Data Visualization and Training at Lovelytics. Lovelytics is a Tableau partner company based out of Arlington, Virginia, and I'm also a 3-time Tableau Zen Master. But most importantly, I am not a designer, and let me show you why. So my Tableau journey began about 11 years ago as a student at Howard University, and my professor provided us with an assignment and said, make sense of this data. Now, the data set was way too massive to open in Excel, and the assignment was due a couple of hours later. It was probably like 3 o'clock in the morning, and I still hadn't done it yet. So through a quick Google search, I ran into Tableau and I downloaded it, watched maybe a video or two, and these were the very first visualizations that I ever created. And as you can see, I didn't even bother to take off the sheet 4 default header before I presented this in the class the next day. But Tableau really intrigued me that night. I really liked the ease of it, the use of it. I liked the ability to quickly analyze data, and it just captivated me. And I decided that I was going to make it my thing. So over the course of the years, I worked at Johnson & Johnson, I worked at Comcast, worked at Lovelytics, and I started to pick up, more and more Tableau skills. I also started to pick up more design skills along the way, and I've had zero design training. So here are some of the visualizations that I'm able to create as of today without these, graphic design skills. So the goal of today is really to show you how you can go from those visualizations that you see on the left-hand side to some more captivating visualizations that you see on the right-hand side without having any type of design skills. So the 5 design secrets that we'll talk about today. First, how do you effectively gather requirements? Because essentially requirements are the first part of a dashboarding project. Second, how do you create a template? Many users go right into Tableau once they have some data, they start building out charts. But typically what I like to do is I like to take those requirements and go build out a template first so that it can enable or really speed up the development process of the dashboard. Third, how do you use icons and art to your advantage? How do you pick colors strategically instead of just placing colors everywhere for your charts? And then how do you uncomplicate fonts? So let's start with the requirements. So the first thing that you want to do when you are presented with a new project is you want to make sure you understand the overall goal of the project. Now, this can seem rather simple, but you'll be surprised that for projects that take 3 or 4 or 5 months, sometimes the overall goal can be lost. So you want to always keep that overall goal in the back of your mind. Next, you want to determine your audience's analytical maturity. For your key stakeholders, are they familiar with Tableau? Have they used Tableau before? Or are they executives who might just expect to see this in a PowerPoint or a PDF? You want to understand that pretty early on because that is going to help you understand how complex really your dashboard can be, how interactive your dashboard should be. Should it be more static, right? Next, you want to think about your end users' preferences. Are there any colors that they want to see? Are there any logos that they want to see? Should you size this a particular way? You'll be surprised the amount of times that I did not do this step and was at the end of a project, designed it in a desktop, and the user says, hey, I actually wanted this for tablet or a mobile device. Now, yes, there are certain features in Tableau that allow you to change to a mobile device, but that just adds on more hours and complexity to the project. So had you known that, or had I known that in the beginning of the project, it would have made things a little bit more smoother. You want to take all of your end users' requirements and have a conversation with them. You want to prioritize those requirements from the most important to the least important. You want to ask them, do you want to see this as a chart or do you prefer to see this as a filter? Many times your end users are going to have like 100 requirements sometimes, and you can't fit 100 different things into your dashboard. So sometimes they're not even looking to actually have it as a visualization, but they just want it as a capability to be able to drill down to something or to filter to something. Next, you want to do a high-level data discovery, right? There are times where we're given a bunch of requirements and the data just isn't there to support that. So you want to make sure that you align the requirements that your end users have with the data that they currently have, or maybe reach out to see who you can get in contact with so that you can access that data. And then last but not least, also have a conversation with your end users about the views that they're going to want to see for their requirements or for their questions. Let's think about this. Sometimes end users always have, they have like a picture in the back of their head about what they expect this visualization to look like. But there are times where they don't communicate that to you. So if they're expecting to see for a trend chart, they're expecting to see like prior year, and you were just thinking that it was current year, that's in the back of their mind. They probably didn't say that. So you just want to ask them like about their views. Do you want to see this as a bar chart, a line chart? Do you want to compare prior year? So I make sure that based off of their requirements, I'm also doing this as well. So to help organize all of this information, I've created a dashboard requirements document. On the left side, we have information about the dashboard itself. We have the name, the goal, the time frame. You have the audience. So is it going to be for an executive, a manager, your analyst? You also have the display mode. Is it going to be used for a laptop, a tablet, or a mobile device? A use case, will it be for the web or a PDF? If it's for the web or a PDF, maybe you can have a scrolling dashboard. Versus if it's for a PowerPoint or an image, you might want to have a more rectangular shaped dashboard. And then you also have dashboard filters and notes. Then on the right-hand side, we have information about the view. Now I consider a view one worksheet within Tableau. So what's it going to take to construct that view? What are the dimensions? What are the measures? Is there anything that we need to display on the marks card? Is there anything that we need to calculate? How should we format this? Should we filter it any type of way? Where's the data located? And does the user have any preferences for this particular chart? So let's look at a use case to show you how I use this document. The VP of sales wants to keep track of sales generated within the company. Overall, he or she wants to know how much each region brings in and which segment generates the most revenue for each region. Currently, this information is provided in an Excel workbook and shows sales per category, sales per segment, monthly sales, and the number of orders. Here's the goal for our dashboard. We want to create an interactive dashboard that analyzes the company's sales data that can be shared with regional leads as well as the VP of the sales team. Which subcategories have the highest sales? What are the sales per region over time? What are the sales profit and profit ratio for each region? What are the sales per state, and which segment and region have the highest sales? So what I've done on the left-hand side is I filled in the dashboard requirements document. We know that this dashboard is going to be for the VP as well as the regional sales. So we've noted executive and management. Our display mode will be a laptop. So we have the specific device size. Our use case will be a web and a PDF. So probably when I'm designing this for like a laptop, I want to make sure that I test how it exports to a PDF. And then we also have information about the dashboard filters, the company colors. And then this VP has actually provided us with an example of something that she saw on Tableau Public so that we can reference that and take bits and pieces from it and use it as inspiration for our own dashboard. Then on the right-hand side, I've just taken one of those requirements and I've detailed out the requirements document for this view. So our primary measure, our dimension is going to be a region. Our primary measures are going to be customers, orders, sales, profit, and profit ratio. I've noted exactly how we're going to calculate customers, orders, and profit ratio. I have the data source as well. And then here we've noted that the VP would actually like to see this as a text table. So then from there, based off of all of the requirements and the questions that our end user provided us, we're going to need a view requirements document for it. And once we put it all together, we now have about 7 different documents that outline in detail all of the requirements that we need for this dashboarding project. So next, I go into building the template. I don't go right into Tableau, bringing the data and start creating charts. I actually start with the template to help organize my thoughts. So the first thing that I do when I'm building out my template is I prioritize those requirements and I'm only using what's important. So this goes back to having a conversation with your stakeholders and your end users and asking them, what's the most important thing? Because that is exactly how you want to lay out your dashboard. So here we've organized all of those requirements from highest priority to lowest priority. The most important thing is the overall number of customers, and the least important thing is going to be the sales per category. Next, we're using blank text boxes with context in Tableau, pen or paper, or some form of a wireframing tool to actually sketch out what this dashboard will look like based off of those requirements. Here are some of my favorite tools. Obviously, Tableau is one of the easiest tools to create a template because everything is done directly within the software. Balsamiq is another tool that I use personally at work, especially when I'm working with external clients. Figma is a tool that I use for more modern backgrounds, and NinjaMock is another wireframing tool, very similar to Balsamiq. I personally do not use it, but I know other individuals who do use it instead of Balsamiq. So here's an example of a Tableau template. The first thing that I'm doing is I'm placing, I'm starting a new dashboard and I'm placing text boxes on the dashboard and I'm just providing context for what should go into that text box. So I'm saying here, this will be a line chart that shows the monthly sales per region. This will be a text table. This will be a highlight table. And this just allows you to adjust the spacing, adjust the size, make sure that everything can fit into this dashboard without you having to do this when you have actual charts on there. Here's an example of a Balsamiq wireframe. As I mentioned, Balsamiq has more of a visual representation of a wireframe or what a template could be. What you do within Balsamiq is a little bit different from what you would do within Tableau. You're actually creating sketches or visualizations. But what's neat about it is that you can easily move these around. So I don't have to have data to create this line chart, but I could just copy and paste it and put it into each of these boxes here. Same thing with the view that you see on the right-hand side. So visually now my end user can see exactly what this dashboard is potentially going to look like based off of their requirements. And here's an example of a Figma template. Figma is also a free tool. And as I mentioned, I use it for modern designs within Tableau. I export the image from Figma and I import the image into Tableau, and then I float all of the worksheets on top of them. When you're creating your template, you also want to make sure that you are designing to a grid. If you think about newspapers or magazines, everything is in a column or grid-like format because that is one of the easiest ways for your end users to consume information. So obviously when you're designing your dashboard, you also want to make sure that you're designing to a grid as well. In this example, even though we have an odd number of charts that are going to be on our dashboard, we're still using a grid-like template. Look at the bottom two charts, sales per state and sales per subcategory. The intersection lines up perfectly with the two charts above it. So even though you have an odd number, still make sure you're designing to a grid. Here's an example of a 4-chart grid, a 3-chart grid. Also, when you're creating your template, try to think about where you can incorporate bands and add some context. A band is simply a big aggregated number. It provides an intro to a particular metric that is displayed in detail on your dashboard. Our dashboard is looking at regional sales. Everything is at the regional level. So at some point, this VP is going to want to know what's the overall numbers, what's the overall sales. Instead of using a grand total bar or using a text table to display that, you can simply use a band to have that number. You could even have a KPI that says this is up or down versus previous year or previous months. So I like to incorporate bands into my template as well. Because bands are intro numbers to your dashboard, you want to make sure that you place them in areas where your end user's eye will first see them. So either place them at the top of your dashboard or place them on the left side of your dashboard. Here's an example of a left-sided band. Here's an example of where you do not want to place your bands. You do not want to place them on the right side at the bottom because these are the last areas that your end users are going to see. You also want to make sure that when you're creating your template that you're using size and position to show hierarchy. So what do I mean by that? Typically, when I'm building out my template, the first thing that I do is I determine where I'm going to place the filters. Now, typically when you're bringing filters into your dashboard, there's a vertical pane on the right-hand side that automatically comes in. And I personally find that that vertical pane that comes in takes up too much real estate. So depending upon the number of filters that the end user is asking for, I'll either place my filters right below the dashboard title or above the band area, or I'll place it in a collapsible container in the top right corner. Then from there, you want to go back to the list of requirements, the one that you ordered, based off of highest priority to lowest priority, and you want to lay out your template according to that list. So the most important item should be in your top left corner and the least important item should be in your bottom right corner. And last but not least, start to think about where you could place icons and the use of color when you're building your template as well. I'll go into more detail on icons, but typically I'm placing icons within the band area of my dashboard. You never want to overcomplicate it and place icons, everywhere like we see in the second example here, because the goal is to let your icons have, add a bit of visual appeal and not really distract from the overall visualization. So I like to just place icons either for my export buttons up top or within the band area that you see here. And once you have your template, fill in your template. So here, I went ahead and I built out all of the worksheets. And then I took those worksheets and I placed them into these text boxes and I deleted the text box and the worksheet just ended up taking up the space. So it makes the design or the development process of your dashboard actually pretty easy once you have that template. And here's an example of another Tableau template that I created. And then I went ahead and I built out all of the worksheets and placed them into the template and removed all of the boxes. Here's an example of a balsamic wireframe. So there's an extra step that has to be added in when you're doing a balsamic wireframe because you're going to create the wireframe first in balsamic, and then you're probably going to template out that wireframe in Tableau and then build the worksheets. But I always find that when I have a balsamic wireframe, it's easier to get the client to sign off on a visualization before we actually go and develop it. And what I want to call out about this particular wireframe is that I had a colleague actually build out the dashboard on the right-hand side based off of the wireframe that I created on the left-hand side. And here are our template guidelines. And once you have a really good template, I always say reuse your template, especially within organizations. And especially if you have new users within your organization, right? So here we have a Lovelytics template that's used for 2 different use cases, one for an HR use case and one for a sales use case. What you'll see here is that if a new user comes to this, they know that on the left-hand side, they're going to find the refresh date, they're going to find some bands, they're going to just find some filters as well. And same thing when we go to like the sales use case, they know exactly like where to look for these things. In large organizations, I think it's super important, especially if you're trying to get your users to adopt to Tableau, that you have a very similar look and feel for your dashboard so that they don't have to question where to filter, when was the data refresh, things like that. So layout, fill in, and reuse. Let's talk about using art to your advantage. Using simple images and icons can take your dashboard from basic to visually appealing. The first thing that you want to do when you're selecting icons for your dashboard is you want to make sure that you pick icons that communicate meaning and are easy to recognize. Typically, if you see a home icon somewhere, you're going to know that clicking on that is going to go back to the home page. If you see an info icon, you'll know you're going to learn more information, a data source icon. These are icons that you do not have to think about, right? So you want to make sure that you pick icons for your end users that they also do not have to think about. In this example, we have 4 icons within our band area. For our customers, we're using a simple person icon. For our orders, we're using a simple box. For our sales, we're using a simple sales tag. And for our money, our profit, we're using a money bag as well. These are icons that our end users don't have to think about. If there are any icons that are on your dashboard that your end user should have interaction with, you want to make sure that you are labeling it and you're providing that context. Typically, your band labels will provide the context for any icons that are next to your bands. But if there's like a logo or home button that you want them to click on, you have to tell them that. Never assume that your end user knows how to interact with something just because you built it and you know how to interact with something. So if you have a home icon, say click to return to the home page, or simply have like a tooltip in that area. Same thing with the hover icon. In this example, we have 4 icons and they're all with our bands. But if you look in the top right corner where we have the Tableau conference icon, you didn't know that you could click on that and go to the home page. So now just by adding that context, now the user knows they can click on that and go to the Tableau conference homepage, or you can have a mouse over in that area so that when they hover over it, they know they can click on it and go to the homepage. When you're selecting your icons, make sure you pick simple icons, nothing too creative. Sometimes these icons are really small on your dashboard, so anything that's too small is probably just going to be a blur to your end user. So make sure you pick some icons that your end users can recognize, and they don't have to have like 2 stories, windows, doors, doorknobs, because the smaller they are, the harder they're going to be to see. So in this example, we have 4 simple icons here, but here we have icons where we got a guy with a beard and a bun, and you can't even see in the dashboard that there's a bun there. You can only see it because it's large here. So make sure you're picking simple icons and nothing too creative. Also make sure that if you have icons that are in the same real estate area on your dashboard, and I'll show you some examples and explain more about this, make sure they have the same style and they're consistent and cohesive throughout. So if you have all of the same icons in one area, it should all be either solid icons or all silhouette icons. You don't want to have, like on the second example here, you don't want to have one icon that just looks different from the other 2 and they're all in the same area, because that one icon is going to stick out. And same thing like the bottom level that you see here, that info icon is the one that's sticking out. In this example, we have 4 icons in our band area. Once again, they were all silhouette icons except that one customer icon that's a solid icon. And as you can see, it sticks out compared to the other ones. Something else you want to do when you're picking your icons is you want to make sure that they go with the overall dashboard theme and color scheme. So if your entire dashboard is purple and gray, your icon should either be purple or gray. Just because you have a bunch of company colors or brand colors doesn't mean you have to use all of them within your dashboard. So if your dashboard is purple and gray, you don't need a blue or red or a green icon if you're not using blue, red, or green anywhere else on the dashboard. Here's an example of what you should not do. Our customer color palette had this blue associated with it, but we're not using this blue teal anywhere else on our dashboard. So there's no need for us to use it for our icons. And last but not least, make sure you're reducing the icon graphic details. And this goes hand in hand with making sure your icons are not too creative, right? You don't need a house that has a front lawn. You don't need an info icon that's in a magnifying glass. It's okay to just have really simple icons. Icon graphic details, that's just the lines and the curves associated with it. The more lines and curves you have, the harder it's going to be able to see those details if it's small. So make sure that you're picking really simple icons. In this example, we have icons that are all silhouette icons. They all have the same look and feel to them. However, they have a lot of details associated with them. And as you can see, it's kind of hard to tell what all of those details are once you place them on the dashboard. And yes, you can use icons for business dashboards. I do this all of the time. So here's an HR dashboard where we're looking at employee turnover. What I want to call out is that the reason that my icons are green and that it's okay for me to have green icons here is because I'm using the Lovelytics logo in the top right corner. If I didn't have that logo there with that green in it, then I probably should not be using green icons within the band area. Here's an example of a sales dashboard. As you can see, I have a bunch of different icons on this dashboard. Within the band area, all of the icons that are there, they all have that circle behind them. So I wouldn't want to have just one icon that didn't have the circle behind it. And then in the top right corner where I have all of my export buttons, all of those have the same look and feel to them as well. Here's an example of a webinar conversions dashboard. And what I want to call out with this one is that there are many real estate areas on this dashboard. On the left-hand side where it says webinars, upcoming, and previous, that's considered one real estate area. And all of the icons that are there, they're all silhouette. They all have the same look and feel to them. Versus in the center where we have the band icons, all of those icons have the same look and feel to them. They're all in the same real estate area. And then up top, we have another real estate area where we have the filters and the export buttons, and all of those icons have the same look and feel to them. Here's an example of a marketing dashboard. With this one, I'm making sure that all of the icons that are in the band area have the same look and feel, making sure all of the icons follow the overall dashboard color scheme of either yellow or gray. And then in the top right corner where I have my export buttons, as you can see, that's a different real estate area of the dashboard. All of those icons have the same look and feel to them as well. And a couple of places that I get my icons from, Flat Icon is my favorite site. You can easily sign up for a free account and edit the look and feel of your icons all for free. In this example that you see here of this dashboard, those two icons at the top, those were not the original colors of those icons. I was able to sign up for a free account and change the color of them to match the color of my dashboard. The Now project is not free, but it has a really great gallery. I think it's $100 a year, and the same thing with Icons 8. And these are our icons and art guidelines. Now let's talk about choosing colors that matter. So the first thing that we want to do when we're picking colors for our dashboard is we want to make sure we let the brand colors form the basis of a dashboard. We want to pick one dominant color from our brand colors and let it form the basis. So what do we mean by the basis? The basis of your dashboard, you can consider that your titles, your headers, your labels, and your icons. So in this example, we've picked one dominant color, which is that purple, and we're using it for the basis of our entire dashboard. In this example here, we have the Lovelytics blue as well as the Lovelytics green. We're using the blue for the basis in terms of all of the headers, and then for all of the icons, we're using that green. And here's another example of a web analysis dashboard. We have four dominant brand colors, but we're only using the blue and the orange. The blue is what we're using for the basis of the dashboard, and the orange is what we're using for like the icons and the highlighting. You also want to get inspiration from art and other visuals. It's okay to be inspired. You don't always have to start from scratch with your dashboards. I do this all of the time. I'm always inspired by visualizations that I come across on Tableau Public. Here's an example. I had to create an NBA ticket sales dashboard, and I just did not know how I wanted to lay this dashboard out. I only knew how to color it. So I came across a visualization that you see on the left-hand side on Tableau Public, and I took bits and pieces of it. I took the stadium layout, kind of the panel that you see on the left, and the idea of having the bands there, and I created the visualization that you see on the right-hand side. In this example, I came across this dashboard on Pinterest. And what I liked about it was that it had a really nice color scheme. I also liked the layout of it. So I took the color scheme for sure. And I also took bits and pieces of the layout, and I created the visualization that you see on the right-hand side. Here's another example. What I wanted to do with this dashboard was I wanted to incorporate about 5 different dashboards into one workbook, but not have the typical Tableau user interface of clicking the tabs at the top to navigate from dashboard to dashboard. So I came across the visualization that you see on the left-hand side on Pinterest again, and I really like the fact that you could drill into dashboards at the top, and then you could also interact on the left-hand side. So I took that user interface and I incorporated it and built out the visualization that you see on the right-hand side. Next, when you're picking colors, you want to make sure you limit the number of dominant colors. I always say use no more than 2. A dominant color is simply a color that isn't white or a really light gray or a really light color. In this example, we have 4 dominant colors within our color palette, but the gray is a neutral color, and so is the white. So for our dashboard, we're only picking 1 dominant color, which is that purple, and we're using it within our dashboard. In this example, we're picking 2 dominant colors. We have the dark blue that forms the basis of the dashboard, and then we have the orange that is used for everything else. And here's an example of what you do not want to do with color, right? Just because you have a lot of colors within your brand color palette, you don't have to use all of them within your dashboard, right? Stick to 1 dominant color and let everything else be either light gray or white. You also want to make sure you're creating accessible color schemes with your dashboard and you're testing them. As I mentioned before, you never want to assume that your end user can interact and see the dashboard the same way that you can. So typically what I do, once I'm finished the dashboard and I want to test the color schemes, and I want to test the shadings and make sure that the end user can see, the color shadings where I've intended for them to be able to see that. I plug it into a simulator, and as you can see here, it does change for an individual who might be blue weak or blue blind, but they're still able to pick up on the different shadings and the different tones of that purple. Here's another example. For this one, I wanted to make sure that the end user could see the clusters on the map, as well as the highlighting on the heat map and the highlighting of the maximum bar. And as you can see, the colors drastically change for an individual who might be red weak or red blind or green weak or green blind. However, because I'm using neutral colors for everything else, the white and the black, you're able to see that pop of color where I intended for the end user to see it. And here's an example of what you do not want to do with color. We're also tempted to use the red and the green. However, as you can see, somebody who is like red blind, they're not going to be able to differentiate between Texas or California being the highest. You also want to make sure that you're using color purposefully and for reinforcement. So in this example, I'm using color purposefully. Wherever you see that purple shading, that's me trying to highlight something where necessary. I'm not just using purple just because. I'm specifically trying to highlight or call out something with color. In this example, I'm trying to reinforce something. So I'm trying to reinforce the maximum data point for every bar chart that you see on here. So that's where you see the blue that's highlighted. That just means that is the maximum bar for each of these charts. And in this example, where you see the blue, that's related to one ticker, where you see the gray, that's related to another ticker. So I'm using color purposefully in this example because I'm making sure I keep those colors consistent throughout. So typically what I actually do is I design all of my dashboards in gray. and then I pick one dominant color and I apply it strategically to each of my charts. Typically, I'm just using it to highlight the maximum value of each of my charts. So let's talk about how to design in grayscale first, and then use color to highlight. So here's what a dashboard will look like when I first create it. I don't add color or anything or format anything until my dashboard has been built out. So all of my dashboards actually start out in grayscale. So I've taken away all of the color from this dashboard. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to add colors for our title areas and our band areas. And remember, we're going to use a dominant brand color to do that. Next, we're going to go through each of our worksheets individually and say, is there anything that I want to highlight on that chart? If you look at the spark point that's on this line chart, yes, we probably want to highlight that. The circle already highlights that that is the maximum value, but we might want to draw a little bit more attention to it by adding color. We have a text table in the center, 5 different metrics. We probably do not want to color that text table because 2 metrics should never have the same color. And there's 5 metrics there. So we definitely don't want to use 5 colors on the dashboard. And then you have the segment and region highlight table or text table. So we could use color to highlight which segment and region has the highest sales. So that's what that would look like. Then if you go to your sales per state map, a lot of circles on there. We could use color to highlight the maximum state. And then for our sales per subcategory chart, that is the least important visualization on this dashboard. So I'm actually going to leave that as a neutral color so that we do not draw attention to it. So the next step is to add your final touches, add different borders, your worksheet titles, test out different shadings. But what I don't think you should do when you're doing that is have these really dominant borders and dominant shadings. Yes, it's okay to section out your dashboard. Yes, it's okay to have borders. Yes, it's okay to have shading, but you want to make sure that once again, you're using a neutral color to do that, like a really light gray, so that your end user can still see those sections, but it's not distracting and creating noise within your visualization. So here's what that final dashboard will look like. Our color guidelines. Uncomplicated fonts. So the first thing that you want to do when you are picking a font for your dashboard is you want to make sure you're selecting just one font and that it's a legible font. Now, typically this is a font that you might have within your organization or just a Tableau recommended font in general. So in this example, we have one font, but it's not a very legible font. So always make sure that you're picking a legible font. I always say, if you're in question, definitely just use like a Tableau book font. And if you're in question of whether or not there are multiple fonts within the dashboard, always go to format in your toolbar, select format workbook and select the font. And that's going to change the font for the entire workbook so that you can make sure you're only using one font in the entire workbook. Then you want to make sure you have no more than 4 sizes of that font type. So typically, if I have more than one dashboard within my workbook, all of the dashboard titles need to have the same size. All of my worksheet titles need to be the same size as well. Chart headers as well, and your text and your label, all of those should have the same size. It's all about consistency. You never want to have one worksheet that has a size 15 font and another worksheet that has like a size 12. Your user is going to be able to pick up on those small things. So you can just add like a little bit of formatting to really enhance your dashboard and making sure that your fonts are consistent throughout. Try to avoid custom fonts if possible, especially if you're using Tableau Public or Tableau Online. There are really only a handful of fonts that are compatible with Tableau Online and Tableau Public, versus if you have an internal server at your organization and you have a font that you want to use, you should probably check with your site admin to see if that font is uploaded on your server, your Tableau server or not. Because if it's not, or because if you're using a non-compatible font, it's going to change that font to a different style. So it might look one way on your desktop because your desktop has that font. But if you upload it to Tableau Online or Tableau Public or to a server that doesn't have that font, then it's going to render it as a different font. Next, you want to be strategic with your fonts and your background colors. And this goes hand in hand with accessibility once again, except this is contrast accessibility. So if you're using a white background, you have gray font, or if you have a color background, you have color font, you want to make sure that there is enough contrast between those two colors so that your end users can see it. I like to use a tool called accessiblecolors.com that lets me pick up or input the text color, the text size, my background color, and see if it passes the web content accessibility guidelines in terms of the contrast that you should have for digital material. So in this example, I have this blue background, I have this mustard yellow on top of it, and I wanted to make sure that the end user, there was enough of a ratio between this blue background and this mustard yellow for the smallest font size on my dashboard, which was a size 9. So I plugged it in and the tool told me that it passed the compliance. Versus if I were to darken that yellow just a little bit, as you can see, it did not pass. But what's neat about this tool is that it allows you, or it just shows you other options so you could change your background color, your text color to something else. Here we have gray and we have blue. Grays and blues, hardest colors to see. So I wanted to make sure that the end user could see this blue background or this blue font on this gray background. And as you can see, it passes. But if I were to lighten the gray background, it would not pass. Next, when you're using fonts or you're picking fonts, use color and or bolding to draw emphasis to anything on a dashboard that you want to, make sure your end user's eyes catch. So in this example, I have a paragraph at the top of my dashboard. It's detailing information about the survey that the visualization is taking into account. So I didn't want to assume that the end user would actually read the entire paragraph. So what I did was I used color and bolding to emphasize the stats in the text that I wanted to draw the end user's attention to. On the left-hand side, you'll see you're just assuming that the end user is going to just read this paragraph versus if you just add a little bit of visual highlighting or little, color or something, as your end user is even just skimming that paragraph, their eyes automatically drawn to those numbers. Just don't bold the entire paragraph because that's the same thing as like not having any emphasis on it. And last but not least, if you have large bodies of text, align left and stay away from center and right alignment, only if it's for design purposes though. So in this example, we have a paragraph on a dashboard. I always say anything more than like 3 or 4 sentences, you definitely want to align left, because if you center align, you're forcing your end user to look at where each line begins and ends, and it's just adding a little bit more processing time to that paragraph. And these are our font guidelines. So in summary, start with your audience and their requirements, build your template and add your views, incorporate design elements that will enhance your story, add color strategically, icons for charm, and use the rule of 4 when selecting fonts. Remember, anyone can be a designer. It's not something you're born with. It's not something exclusive to a select few. All it takes is practice while keeping a few design secrets in mind. And with that, thank you all so much for having me. Here's my contact information if you would like to contact me. And if you would like to learn more design secrets, I typically try to post on my blog at designsecretsforanondesigner.com. And you'll also find the requirements document for free on the site as well. And with that, I'll open it up for any questions that you all have.
Great. Thank you so much, Chantilly. You can see there's a raucous applause happening in the chat right now. And thank you also for ending with that, because I'd say for the first 5 questions are, how do we get the dashboard requirement document? So please go to that website. That's where the document is. And there's a ton of questions in here, but I'll pick a couple because I do want to make sure we have, Robert also has some time. But one that was, I think, really interesting, especially on this theme of being a non-designer. This person is a visual learner / designer. How would you suggest using the templates when you don't have the kind of end product to work back from? So you're kind of staring at this blank screen. How do you approach creating the template?
It goes back to the requirements, right? So I believe 90%, or we could even say 80% of all dashboarding projects start with requirements. It's very rare that you're just doing an exploratory analysis where your user saying is like, show me something. And even then, the end user still has something in the back of their head that they want you to come up with. They just haven't portrayed that information to you possibly. So I would say if you go back to your requirements and you have a list of these requirements, start to think about the best chart types for each of those requirements. And then you're saying, okay, this will be best visualized as a map. All right, I need to have enough room on my dashboard for a map, or this should be a line chart. I need to have enough room for this line chart. And that's how you take like bits and pieces. You can also, a really neat trick is to also use sticky notes to do that, right? So you can lay sticky notes out on a table and start to move things around like that, and then go to Tableau and create the template based off of your sticky note layout.
Yeah, no, all great. I also use a whiteboard as someone who's also like not a visual learner, because it lets me kind of mess up, erase, and then eventually, I think just like the sticky notes, you can pick them up and move them around while you're trying to design. I think another kind of question that might be somewhat, well, I guess when it comes to the client side of this, because I think this could be helpful for a lot of people. The question was kind of, how do you deal with customers who don't know their data well enough to be specific about the requirements? I guess maybe even broadening in that, if your client or your end user is just struggling to really give you a set of requirements that you can actually use, how do you deal with that as a developer?
I think I try to get to the root of their business. I try to turn it from like a gathering requirement session to more of a conversation to understand what drives their business, right? Tell me your line of business. Tell me, how do you know you've been successful at the end of the year in your business? Is it a number that you're meeting, right? Customer satisfaction. Oh, okay, you know, that might be a metric that we might want to report on. How do you know you're successful if you had a higher turnout from this year compared to last year? So typically what I found is that when we talk about gathering requirements with end users, that phrase might scare them, right? But if you turn it into a conversation, but you as the developer, you're taking notes, you know, kind of like if you're in therapy or something, how they're just sitting there taking notes, but you don't even know like what they're, you know, they're trying to help you out, but they're not trying to like directly, you know, say it. So I do the exact same thing with my clients. And at the end of that, I'll say, okay, what I found was that these are the things that drive your business, right? These are the departments that you're probably looking at to impact the business. Now, who could I contact to maybe get some information on the data for this? And then I start to bring in like a data engineer into the conversation, things like that. So I always say for clients that don't have requirements, turn it into a conversation, right, about their business. And you try to analyze that conversation now and help derive the metrics that drive the business.
Yeah, I love that. I think most times we tend to end up being the therapist in the room. So I think most people can understand that. And then one last one before we turn it to Robert. And if you have time, there's plenty more here in the Q&A for you to look through. But do you have a preference? I know you've done this before where you've taught people kind of the light and dark dashboards. When you are designing, do you have a preference around light and dark, I guess, or how might you approach that kind of, you know, conversation?
Yeah. So for business dashboards, I'm typically leaning towards more of the light color, just because that's more of like what they're used to. But if I want to do more of a darker tone dashboard, I definitely try to get some buy-in from the client. You know, sometimes those darker tone dashboards can scare them. So
Sure.
I kind of, if they say, oh, I want a little bit more flair, I'm like, all right, maybe we could change the background color. How would you feel about that? But I would say for business dashboards, I do lean towards the lighter tone.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense, I think. Especially if you're not a client that's used to dashboards, they may not be familiar. They're used to Excel and PowerPoint, and all of those tend to be light frames. Cool. Thank you so much, Chantilly. Again, I think most people I saw somewhere in the chat, one of the best presentations they've seen all year. Lots of people really, really happy to have been here for that. So thank you for taking some time.
Thank you.
All right. One more for you. Robert, and we've been on a really good streak as of late, getting some folks from Tableau themselves. Robert is a research scientist at Tableau, and has been there since 2012. His research is around visual perception, storytelling, communicating with data. Also was previously a professor of computer science at UNC Charlotte. So you can see the kind of theme we've had so far already. He's also a blogger at a blog called Eager Eyes, which is also his Twitter handle, and is doing some YouTube as well. So lots of resources available from Robert. So we'll turn it over to him to talk about folding time and comparing values with index charts.
All right, thank you. Let me try and share my screen now here. I'm not very used to Zoom, so I'm going to be see if we can move this bar out of the way to actually be able to play my presentation. Sorry about that. I'm not usually that challenged when it comes to technology, but I'm not as used to Zoom as to Google Meet. Okay, so this should work. Hopefully, you will see my screen, my slides now. Yep. All right. So what I want to do here, thank you. So what I want to do here is talk about index charts, and you might think, well, I know what index charts are. They're kind of, I do them all the time, but you may not have seen all the different things you can do with them. So I want to show you a little bit of the gamut of what index charts are and how to create those in Tableau. I'm going to go into this briefly. I'm going to try and keep this fairly quick since I'm the last one here. Oh, and I was going to say to Vince's point about midlife crisis, that my project for this pandemic is to learn to play music. And so one of the things that I've done is I did not get an electric guitar. I got an electric bass, which is very different. And I'm also getting into synthesizers. This is not mine. This is just a picture I found on the internet, but I'm very interested in synthesizers and how they work, what you can do with them, and even trying to make some music. So we'll see. But I'm not going to bore you or scare you with any of my own creations here. What I do want to talk about is index charts. And so I have a little classification here on what they can be, and then I'll show you examples in a moment. So the most common one that you probably have seen before are the ones where you index on the vertical axis, the y-axis or the dependent axis. And it's called the dependent. So the dependent axis is the vertical axis in a line chart or in a scatter plot. And it's dependent because its values depend on the independent axis, which is the one that's usually the x-axis, the horizontal axis. And so when you index on that vertical, on the values, basically that's what you commonly do as index charts. That's the common type of index that people know about. But there is also indexing on the x-axis. And that's actually the more interesting one because it's a lot richer. And I will show you a few examples of that. And usually there's time on the x-axis, because usually these charts are line charts. And so there can be regular time intervals. And you actually just saw one earlier in Vince's presentation, of course, the year-over-year change. I'll show you that as well, but I will make a lot more noise about the indexing part of it. But then also there are irregular time intervals. So what if you want to compare certain events or times that you want to compare to each other that do not happen at regular intervals? For example, pandemics or recessions, things like that. I have lots of fun examples like that. Well, I have some examples, but that's the kind of thing that you might want to look at. And then you might not even have time on that horizontal axis. It's pretty unusual, but I have one example that I found that I want to show because I think it's pretty interesting. And then actually what happens quite a bit too is that you do them both, right? So you index both vertically and horizontally, and I'll show you what that looks like as well. So we'll start with indexing values. This is the most obvious one. And because many of the examples do both, I'm going to have to start with this one because then later this will come back when we talk about time. So here's an example. This is fairly old. I usually try to update my examples, but this one I couldn't find in your version. This is a World Bank report about consumer spending at the beginning of this pandemic. So this is comparing December 2019 here as the first data point, and then all the other data values here that you see on all this very brightly colored different lines are relative to that first point. So if you look at that bright or this kind of lighter blue that has this little dip down, that one is China, and that would mean that China's retail sales dropped very early in January, but then actually stayed at a reasonably high level compared to the other countries. And so you can see how different countries did differently and how they either dipped earlier or later, and also how they recovered. And of course, this only goes until about a year ago or so. So this is not a very current chart anymore, but it's kind of interesting from a historical point of view. And I think it's useful as a way to think about how indexing works when it's purely on value. So the idea here being that we have a reference point that is December, in this case, December 2019, and then everything else is relative to that. And the way you do this mathematically is you just divide the value. And I'll show you this in a moment in Tableau, but you just take the value of each of those months. So for the US, for Germany, China, Brazil, and so on, you take each value that you get for amount of sales and divide that by that value for December 2019 for that same country. And that means you're going to end up at the value of 1 or 100% for that first data point, and then everything else is relative to that. We can do this in Tableau too. I'll show you this in a moment. I was going to profusely apologize here because my examples tend to be very US centric, but at least from the chat, it looks like a lot of people here are actually US based. So at least maybe those other people are a bit more enthusiastic about saying hi in the chat, but at least it's not overwhelmingly European. So again, to all Europeans, I apologize. These are all very US centric examples. And my final disclaimer before I get into Tableau is that I'm by no means a Zen master. I'm just a Tableau employee, so don't expect too much Tableau magic from me. This is just me trying to show you a few things here in Tableau. So I'm not the most, certainly not the best presenter in Tableau, that's for sure. But also, I might not be the most, well-versed Tableau user in the world. All right, so enough of that. Enough preliminaries. So this is an example here. I'm just going to try to rearrange my screen here a little bit, because Zoom likes to cover up all the buttons that I need. Okay, so here I have a dashboard that is that shows me the Case-Shiller home price index. That is, if you're not familiar, that shows how the home prices change over time in the US. This is done for 20 cities, and then there are a few additional averages that they make for the whole US, and this goes back to the beginning of 2000. So this is the beginning, or sorry, yeah, 2000, January 2000. Here's the first value, and that's where everything is indexed to 100. So all of these values are at 100. We don't actually see the actual home prices. We just see that index here, and then it keeps going here across the years. And this data I just got a couple weeks ago, I think. This goes until June this year. So this is as recent as you can be with this data set. And it's really interesting to look at, of course, especially if you're in the US. So I'm currently in New York State, so that's why I picked New York City here. But I can highlight different cities here and see what they look like relative to other cities. And I think Chantilly was talking about getting inspiration from various sources. I like to take inspiration from news graphics. So I stalk a lot of news graphics journalists on Twitter, and I really like to see what they do at the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, the Economist, a few other places, the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, for example, too, in Europe. There are a few more, Frankfurter Allgemeine as well. So there are a number of really good outlets, media, newspapers, as they're still called, I guess, that do really good work. And they tend to be very, very good at just thinking about getting a point across and doing things that are efficient and still very much data-based. And that to me is a very valuable thing to do. So what I've done here is, and I'll show you this in a moment, how this works. It's very simple, but I've tried to reduce the amount of clutter and sort of like noise here. That's why all of the lines that I only need as background or as context are gray. And then the one that I want to look at in more detail is blue and is much heavier. So this is Detroit right now. So if you're familiar with sort of the US economic space, you might be familiar with how badly Detroit was hit by the housing crisis and the recession in 2007, 8, 10, 9, 10, and how long it actually took for them to recover. And so this is relative, right? So this is from the beginning of 2000. So it shows that they had a little bit of a housing bubble. So this was a big problem in the US. There was this massive bubble. You can see this really well in places like Las Vegas, where actually Vegas isn't actually that impressive. Los Angeles is better, and Miami, I think Miami is actually the top one there. And so the housing prices went up like crazy, and then they crashed really hard in 2009. And so we can now look at this relative to each other. So we can see these different cities. So here's Miami. You can see how Miami had this big bubble and then crashed fairly far down, but now has been going up again. And of course, the interesting and scary part here in the US is that currently housing prices here are going up like crazy. So that you can see that this last year, it's just been like, it's almost vertical. So it's just, and it's happening everywhere. It's a total mystery to me why. So I live in Seattle, and you can see that Seattle didn't have as much of a bubble, but then there was a little bit of a dip, and it's been just going nuts, going just up like crazy. And so this is, so the reason I'm explaining all this is that you can see this here very well because you're not looking at the actual differences in the prices. So if I were to go from Seattle to Tampa, the prices will probably be like a third or so. I'm certainly somebody's going to get really mad at me for saying this, but housing prices in Tampa are much lower than in Seattle. I don't know the exact values. I'm not going to try and I'm going to try and be a bit more diplomatic now. But I don't care about that, right? I don't care about those differences in the absolute values. What I want to see here is the change, and that's what I'm looking at here. So I can see how much those values have changed relative to a specific point. And this again is an index chart. This is well, it's indexed values already, but I can re-index them. So that's what really makes an index chart interesting, is that I can now say, well, what if I don't care about January 2000? What if let's look at, I don't know, the middle of the housing bubble somewhere in like 2007. And so now I have everything divided by that value at that point here, which is you should see at the top there, which I'm not seeing because my windows here are covered up, but you should see that shows the date, March 2007. And so I can now move this around. I can see, well, if I bought my house at that point in whatever, I have Tampa picked here, then it would have taken me until March 2020 to get the value back up to where it was before, at least on average. And the same, of course, I can do with lots of other values. I could drop into sort of like the dip after the housing crisis and then look from there. And so that way you can compare the different times, but also different places. Like what about, I don't know, Boston, for example, and see what that looks like, which is interesting. I didn't know that Boston's recovery was actually slower, at least from 2014, or I don't know, LA, which looks very much like Boston here, which is kind of interesting too. So how do you do this? Let me show you this very quick. So the way this is done here is I have my values here that are, I'm sorry, I need to rearrange my windows here again a little bit to actually be able to see stuff. Okay, so I have a chart here that very simply has this index on it. And what I can do is I can do, let me show you something else first, and then I'll talk about the indexing. So the easy bit here is the formatting. The formatting is done by just having a parameter, which is simply the name of the city I want to highlight. And then I have a calc here that just asks if the city, which is the field from the data set, or at least, I mean, it's a part of it, is the same as my parameter. And if they're the same, I get true. If it's not the same, it's false. And that's just a Boolean that I then map onto both color and the stroke width, basically here, or the size, I guess, in Tableau. And that gives me this heavier blue line for the current city that I've picked, and just these thinner gray lines for everything else. So it's a very simple sort of like kind of formatting trick. And then for the indexing, what I've done is I have simply this is called index relative here, because the index, the value I'm showing is already an index. But what I have, the way this is done here is that I have a scary looking calc that's actually quite simple. So if we ignore, can I resize this? Okay, so if we ignore pretty much everything after this, all I'm doing here is, sorry, this is jumping around. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking the value here. So sum of index is simply the value that I'm indexing on, which already is an index. And I'm dividing that by a value that I'm looking up, which is simply the first one in that subsection of the table. And first here is because I'm breaking this down by a city that picks up the first value. So meaning December or January 2000, I should say, for each of those cities. And then all it does here, this CN function here simply deals with missing data, which I don't have in this particular data set, but if there were missing data, this would just basically give me a 0 instead of a null. And that's all this is doing here. And then after I divide this at the end, I'm also multiplying by 100. So that's all I need to do here. And then the additional stuff you see here is simply to move that point around where I'm indexing. So to do this thing here, where I can move my index date, that is what the last part of that expression does. So it simply takes the in this function that does the lookup here, I can say the first value and then plus something. And so plus something in this case simply says take the value that is the date that is picked here as the index date, take the month, the difference from January 2000 in months. So this is why it says month here. And then we'll just add that to this first value. And that says, so if this is January 2000, then this whole thing here is 0. And we're just going to look at that first value. If it's February 2000, it's 1. And then we'll look at the second value in the table and so on. And so we'll just go through that, and this just computes how many steps we have to take from the beginning of our data set to the date that I've picked to index on. All right, so I'm going to move on to other things here, but if there are any questions on that, I'm happy to try and answer those later. So the more interesting parts are indexing on time. And so this is now indexing regular time indexing. It's what I call this because we use regular time intervals. And my example here is, and I'll show you another example in a moment in Tableau, but this is very simple and you've all done this before. This is data about camera sales. This is from an organization called SIPA, which is the, I think that it's called something like the Consumer Imaging Products Association, something like that. But basically what they do is they get reports from camera manufacturers about how many products they ship. So what you see here is a chart of the number of products shipped, not sold, for all the major camera manufacturers in 2019. That's this blue line. And it's kind of interesting to see because it's a bit earlier than you would expect. Like there's this kind of increase in February, March, and April, and then it kind of sags a little bit through the summer, and then September, October picks up again, and then it drops down at the end of the year, which is of course different from actual sales because retail sales are going to be happening a bit later than that. And so this is 2019. So and we're looking at the year of 2019 as the blue color. So 2019 is blue, and we're looking at the month across the year. And so if I look at 2020 here, which is now in black, so you can see that there is a big difference here. And you will see in a moment why there are gaps in my line here, but because I'm covering up some data. But basically what you see here is that in 2020, the camera sales dropped off quite a bit. And this has been happening for several years now, that the camera sales have always been going down over the years. But of course, the shape is quite different in 2020. But then towards the end of the year, so from August or so into September, the shape was similar, even though the value was lower. And then 2021, which is why there was a gap there, you can see that it looks a bit more similar than 2019, even though, of course, the numbers are lower again. But the shape is a bit more like the year before rather than the one from last year. Oh, and so here's an example that I was going to show before I go into Tableau, which is the kind of uses by data journalists. This is a very effective way, I think, of showing data about global warming. So this is essentially an index chart, and it's going to show you years from about 1880 up until a few years ago. And this is temperatures across the world. So this is the average temperatures across the world per month. And the point I'm making here is that the rate of change has increased. And I think it's very effective because you don't really care about individual months. But when you watch this, you can see that up until the 1980s, it stays in this kind of lower part here. And as we go into the 90s and the 2000s, it keeps pushing up, and there are new records much more often than before. This again is an index chart, and it's actually pretty easy to do this in Tableau. I've done this. If anybody's interested, I can show that. Probably not today, but this is fairly interesting to do. Very simple to do. It's also very interesting to do because it teaches you a lot. But it's a good use, I think, of index charts. So let me show you. Actually, let me make sure. Oh yeah, one more example here. I'll talk about this in a second. So quick example here, because I'm kind of at the end of this. So let me just briefly show you this because it's pretty obvious, I think, for most folks here. So we're going to do sales. This is Superstore data. We all know and love Superstore, so I figured this would be a good, easy example, even though, of course, I should have realized that other folks might use this before me. And so what I'm doing here is the obvious thing in Tableau. I'm just going to break down my data into years, and in this case, months. So now we have Superstore sales data, very exciting, over 4 years, and we have monthly data. And we have a time axis here, right? So the time axis goes across here, and it's continuous. Even though we've broken it up into years, we go from December 2016 here to January 2017 and so on. But I can now, and this is really what I find this quite exciting. I think it's really interesting, even though it's such an obvious thing that everybody does. I'm going to take the year and I'm going to drop it on color. And so now I have the year on color. So my time axis is no longer continuous because, well, it is continuous within the axis, because we're going from January to December, but I also have the years here on color. So now each year is a different color, and I've stacked them up so I can compare them. And this is really the key to index charts, of course, is that I can do that. And I folded this time axis basically on itself. So I'm now basically, like, if you have a calendar, you can fold those pages back on themselves. It's a very old school metaphor, perhaps, but it's kind of interesting to think about that. And of course, this is super useful because you can do these comparisons here. I'm not going to do any fancy percentage change or whatever. This is just simply looking at a picture, but I think it's quite obvious why this is useful, and it's something that people do all the time. But I think it's quite interesting to think about, like, just how powerful this is as such a simple operation and a concept. Here's just an example of something that I used to show quite a bit, but I've been really lazy the last year. This is my running data over a number of years, number of miles I've been running every year. And I actually stole this idea from a Tableau sales chart that would show our sales sort of like incrementing over the year. And in this case, it's not sales, but it's my miles. And I used to joke, because I use this quite a bit for research presentations to say, well, this is the most interesting data in the world. But it's certainly interesting to me because it helps me see how things change over time. And so here we have the same thing. We have number of miles, in this case, incrementally summed up to the current day. So this is by day. And then each line here is 1 year. But again, it's just regular intervals that I'm indexing on. And then the more kind of unusual one is irregular time indexing. And that one is interesting because it lets you do things or compare things that would be hard to compare otherwise. So this is an interesting chart I found on Twitter. I don't actually know where this comes from originally, but this is a comparison of different technologies and how long it took them to get to 75% market penetration. And so this is an index on the horizontal axis because they started at some point that they picked as sort of like the beginning of each of those technologies. So things like the telephone, electricity, the internet, smartphones, and so on. And you can see how the pace has been picking up. So these older things like the telephone and electricity took a lot longer to reach any kind of like market saturation, whereas some of the newer ones were much, much, much faster. And here's another example of one that I really think is really interesting, and that's what I was talking about, the recessions earlier. This is a classic piece from the New York Times that you can't see anymore because it's in Flash and you can't play Flash stuff anymore, and unless you jump through hoops. But what this shows Yep. So what it shows is different bear markets. But this is now measured. This is not recessions technically, but it's similar. It's looking at when stock price indices were dropping. And so you can see that this, of course, was at different times. So this was in 2009. There was one in the 40s, one in the 60s, and so on. And so you can then compare those to each other. And I'll briefly show you what this looks like in Tableau. And I realize we're at time. So if you want to cut me off, just let me know and I'll stop talking. I can't really see anybody waving at me or like making gestures. So I'll just very briefly show you what this looks like. This is a slightly different data set. This is recessions. What I have is data here about the US GDP, gross domestic product, from the 40s, 1947, until a few years ago. And then I went through and made a little script that basically found times that should count as recessions, which are defined as 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth, so negative GDP growth. But you continue the recession if you only have 1 going up. So you can, if you go down 2 at least, and then you go up 1 and then down again, it's still the same recession. And what I've done here is then basically aligned those. So they're not very pretty because I don't have a lot of data points because we're only looking at quarters here. But these are all kinds of different years that I can compare, or different recessions. This one that started in 1969. Here's the one that started in 2007, one in 1958, and so on. And the way this is calculated is actually quite simple. I have a calculation here that says, given a fixed recession value, this is an LD calc that says find the minimum date. So what this means is that in this recession field here, for each, we're partitioning by the recession ID here, and for each of those, find the first date. And then we'll take that min date here and simply say, well, do math relative to that. So this is the recession offset, which is on the x-axis here, is simply the number of quarters between my minimum date that I can calculate there and the date that I'm looking at. And the GDP change is similar to what you saw earlier with my value indexing, where I'm just basically saying, take the minimum of the, well, sorry, start here. So we'll look up the value, the recession negative value of the recession offset, meaning we're going back as many steps as we need to go, that we just went forward in our table. So basically, if I'm at this point, I'm going to say step back as many steps as it took from here to here, and give me that value, and then I divide the minimum of my GDP I'm taking the value, dividing that by that first value, and that gives me an index. And that's what I'm showing here. So you can see percentage change per quarter. Right, and that's really, oh, and then one more example is that you can also have this, do this when you don't have time on the x-axis. So my example here, this is kind of also sort of strangely out of date, even though it's not that old, but this is from March last year in the New York Times. What they were doing here is they were looking at mobility. So they looked at travel, and I forget what they used. I think they got data from cell phone companies about how much people move around, and they were measuring this relative to the number of cases that were confirmed. So this is not time on the x-axis, this is number of cases, and this is a log scale too. So we've got log scale number of cases on x, which is really unusual, and then the amount of travel relative to before. I don't know what they picked here actually as the reference, and then that is the change that you can see. And the colors here, if you're in the US, should be obvious, but this is red, blue means Republican versus Democrat. And for Europeans, it's very confusing because red in the US means Republican, it means right versus Democrat and left. So red means Republican, and blue is Democrat. So, but these are like Democrat versus Republican leading states. And there have been a lot of differences there, not just in travel, but also in cases, as you can see. So you can do this in lots of different ways. And this was basically my point here, was to show you a bit of that sort of like gamut of different things you can do with the values, indexing on the values, indexing on time in different ways. And of course, both, like some of those that I didn't point out every time, but many of those were actually indexed on both, in both directions. So with that, thank you for sticking around even beyond the end of this. And if there is any more time, any more interest, I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Yeah, thank you so much, Robert. I mean, there's still, quite a bit of people here, which I'm impressed by. So I appreciate those who were able to hang out for a bit. I think in the interest of time, I would mostly ask about, is there the best ways to get either these slides, some of do you have some of the dashboards already on your Tableau Public that people can use and reverse engineer, see some of the calculations that you had?
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to share the workbook. This is not on public. I can put it up on public too. That's easy. Sure. Happy to.
Yeah, either way, we will send out an email with the video and any resources that any of our speakers provide, so that people can go back and look more at this stuff. Yeah, I would say, again, in the interest of time, I may skip through a few of the slides that we were going to talk about, other than to just flash them a bit, mostly for the video. We will be talking about a new member of the TUG leadership. Next week, I have a big thing for her anyway, on next month's call. And Tableau also wanted to celebrate having 2 million Tableau Public authors. So you get to see that. Congrats to all that were joining there. I'll skip over these pieces. Our next meeting is on October 18th. Same kind of time frame, in the middle of the month on a Monday. So feel free to, you can find our information everywhere at this point. And we'll be publicizing it and sending all of you emails about the event as well. So with that, if there are people want to ask questions, we can stay for a couple of minutes, but otherwise, appreciate all of your time. Thanks so much to Ben and Robert for speaking and hanging out and giving us all of their brilliant knowledge. And we will see you all at the October TUG event. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Thanks.